The handcuffs were freezing, but that was not the part that stayed with me. What stayed with me was the fact that my wife did not even turn around to watch the officers put them on me. Evelyn Shaw, CEO of Shaw Global, stood in the lobby of her own tower with her back to me. One hand lifted calmly as her assistant, Grace Parker, handed her a cup of coffee. Behind me, two police officers guided me across the polished marble floor. That floor reflected everything. The officers' shoes, the shocked faces of employees pretending not to stare, the sharp hem of Evelyn's expensive blazer. But her back never moved. Not once. That single detail told me more than any explanation could have. Not simply what kind of woman she was, but how long she had already been that woman. This was not anger. This was not panic. This was not a wife reacting in pain. This was a decision she had made, filed away, and retrieved at the exact moment it became useful. My name is Daniel Carter. I was 34 years old, an architecture consultant by profession, and apparently, as of that night, a criminal accused of raising my hand against Grace Parker. Here is what actually happened. Grace had dropped a stack of project files on the floor of my home office. Those files had taken me 3 weeks to prepare. They were for a consulting project completely unrelated to Shaw Global, completely unrelated to my wife. When I bent down to help pick them up, my hand brushed Grace's wrist. That was all. My palm grazed her skin. She jerked away as if I had burned her. 40 minutes later, she called Evelyn. 2 hours after that, Evelyn called the police. I did not argue in the back of the patrol car. I did not beg. I did not cry. I watched Soul pass outside the window and began making a list. Not a list of people I wanted to destroy. Not a list of insults. A list of my own mistakes. The first mistake was marrying someone I admired instead of someone who actually knew me. The second was allowing admiration to slowly turn into invisibility, and then calling that invisibility peace. The third was staying. By the time we reached the police station, I had counted 11 mistakes. Not 11 grievances. 11 choices that belonged to me. Later, I would understand that this distinction was the thing that saved me. The holding cell smelled of bleach and stale coffee. 3 other men were inside. 2 were asleep. One stared at the wall with the patient expression of a man who had been there before. I sat on the bench near the door and kept my hands still on my knees. They had not given me my phone call yet. I had the right to one, and before using it, I wanted to be very careful about who deserved that call. Not a friend, I realized, because under the fluorescent lights of that cell, I understood that I did not really have friends of my own anymore. I had Evelyn's colleagues, Evelyn's social circle, Evelyn's carefully approved list of acceptable acquaintances. The closest thing I had to an independent friend was Brian Collins, my university roommate, who had texted me happy birthday the year before and received a voice message in return. That was the entire inventory of my personal life. So I called Brian. He answered on the second ring. Close enough. Brian, I said, I need a lawyer. There was a pause. Daniel, it's 11 at night. I know. The next pause was longer. I heard him sit up in bed. Which station? By 2 in the morning, David Lawson arrived. He was not Brian's usual lawyer. Apparently, Brian had made 2 calls before coming himself. David Lawson, I would later learn, was the kind of lawyer people called when a situation had layers. At 2 in the morning, he wore a charcoal 3-piece suit as if disorder was a concept he had never personally encountered. He sat across from me, opened a slim leather notebook, and did not waste time offering sympathy. In 8 minutes, he asked me 11 questions. Then he looked up. You will be released by morning, he said. This is a minor assault allegation. If their only evidence is Grace Parker's statement and your wife's phone call, it will not hold. No physical mark. No witness who saw the contact itself. He paused. Your wife is counting on you being too embarrassed to fight it. I looked at him. She counted correctly 3 years ago. His pen moved. And now, I said, I want to know everything you know about Evelyn Shaw's company finances. His pen stopped. Then it moved again, writing something longer. A faint trace of amusement appeared at the corner of his mouth. I think, David said carefully, we are going to have a productive relationship, Mr. Carter. They released me at 6:47 in the morning. The sky over the city was the color it gets before it decides what kind of day it wants to become. Gray, metallic, unfinished. I stood outside the station holding a paper bag with my phone, wallet, and watch inside. Brian was leaning against a car at the curb. He had brought me vending machine coffee. He handed it to me without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing to do. For a while we simply stood there. Finally, he said, "She actually called the police." MHM. For that. For that. Brian looked down at the pavement. Emotion moved across his face in stages. Disbelief first, then anger, then the slow tightening of his jaw. "Where are you going?" he asked. Good question. I did not have an answer, but I had the outline of one. The apartment belonged to Evelyn. Her name was on the lease. Her furniture filled the rooms. Her paintings hung on the walls, paintings I had never liked and never admitted I disliked. Going back there would mean stepping back into the role of the husband who had been put in his place. I had played that role for 3 years without noticing the stage had been built for exactly that performance. "Not the apartment," I said. "My place." "No." I finished the coffee. It tasted like hot sugar and regret. "David said his office is in Yongsan. I'm going there first." David Lawson's office sat on the 6th floor of an understated building. It was not flashy, which told me he did not need to advertise. At 7:30, he arrived with coffee from a proper cafe, saw me waiting on the hallway bench, and simply unlocked the door. His office had one long table, shelves from floor to ceiling, and a window overlooking the river, silver under the lifting morning gray. He placed coffee in front of me and opened his notebook to the previous night's page. "You asked about Evelyn's financials," he said. "Let me explain something first. I handle estate and corporate law. 6 months ago, I was approached by a firm auditing Shaw Global for a potential acquisition partnership. Due diligence found irregularities." He chose the word carefully. Operational spending irregularities, specifically in executive discretionary accounts. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means someone has been siphoning money very carefully for quite some time." The acquisition talks collapsed. My firm declined involvement. He looked directly at me. I never met the CEO during that process, but I saw the authorization signatures. They belonged to Evelyn Shaw. I sat with that. Not shocked exactly. More like a piece of a machine had clicked into position after facing the wrong direction for years. The unexplained trips. Grace's strange closeness to Evelyn. The way Evelyn's father had looked at me at the last family dinner. Not with the usual rich man's disapproval toward a modest son-in-law, but with something almost like pity. "I want everything," I said. "Every irregularity." David smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting for the right client. I spent the next 3 days at Brian's apartment. His wife, Hannah, made soybean stew the first morning and asked no questions. That, I have learned, is one of the highest forms of grace. I slept on their couch, woke early, and sat by their kitchen window with a notebook, rebuilding the architecture of my own life from scratch. What did I have? 12 years of architectural consulting experience. A portfolio Evelyn had once called impressive for someone without the right connections. At the time, I had taken it as praise. Now I understood it had never been a compliment. A modest savings account in my own name. Evelyn had never known about it because some instinct 3 years earlier had stopped me from merging everything. Call it stubbornness. Call it luck. I called it the one intelligent thing I had done by accident. It was not much, but it was not nothing. I called my old firm, the consulting company I had left after Evelyn gently and persistently suggested it would look complicated for her image if her husband worked within a competitor's network. Of course I had left. I had called it a mutual decision because calling it surrender would have forced me to admit what I was losing. Robert Hayes answered the phone himself. "Daniel," he said warmly, with the tone of a man who had been expecting the call. "I wondered when you'd reach out." "I'd like to discuss coming back," I said. "Freelance at first, if that works." "We have a brief for a cultural complex in Incheon," he replied. 3 consultants declined it. Tight budget. Difficult client. I paused. "I'll take a look." I wrote Incheon in my notebook and underlined it twice. On the 3rd day, David called. "I've arranged a meeting," he said. He did not immediately explain further, which I had begun to understand was his way of signaling importance. "With whom?" "Arthur Whitman." I knew the name. Everyone in business knew Arthur Whitman. He existed at the level above visible power. Not always in the news, not always photographed at charity galas, but present behind significant deals as the name behind the name. Why would Arthur Whitman want to meet me? David's voice stayed carefully neutral. Apparently, he knew your father. My pen stopped moving. My father had been an architect, not a famous one, not the kind whose name appeared on buildings or magazine covers. He was the kind of architect who made things work. He solved the problems more celebrated architects created. He understood drainage, structure, load, and the way a wall met a floor as if those things had feelings. He died when I was 19. For 15 years, I had kept his drafting table with me, wherever I lived, and never questioned why I could not throw it away. The meeting was set for Saturday afternoon at a quiet restaurant with no sign outside, the kind of place reservations reached by reputation rather than advertising. Arthur Whitman was already seated when we arrived. He did not look powerful because of size. He looked powerful because of stillness. He looked at my face the moment I entered. "Daniel Carter," he said, "you have your father's jaw." I sat across from him and let the sentence settle because I did not know what to do with it. "You knew him," I said, "for 32 years. He poured tea himself. Mine first, then David's, then his own. We built something together once," he said. "A community center the city wanted to demolish for parking. We stopped them." A small flicker appeared in his eyes. "Your father never raised his voice. He simply built an argument so well that the other side ran out of ground to stand on. He never told me he knew you. He wouldn't have." Arthur leaned back. He believed influence worked best when it did not announce itself. Then he said, "I have watched your career from a distance, and I watched what happened to it." There was no pity in his voice. That made it reach deeper. "I have a proposition," he continued. "Not charity. I am not sentimental, and I did not invite you here to hand you a reward. I have a cultural foundation project in Songbuk and Yunpyong. Residential arts spaces, community rooms, 2 small performance venues. The architect resigned 6 weeks ago. I need someone who understands buildings the way your father did. Not as statements, as places people live in. What are the conditions?" I asked. His mouth curved with approval. "That you do the work as yourself. Not as Evelyn Shaw's husband. Not as anyone's accessory. Yourself." I thought of my father's drafting table. "Yes," I said. "When I did not come home, Evelyn's first move was to send Grace to look for me. That told me several things at once. She did not want to come herself. She was not worried enough to call the police again, and she was using Grace as a censor." Grace appeared at Brian's building on day 4, wearing a pastel coat and a concerned expression. She asked the doorman whether Mr. Carter had been seen there. The doorman told her no one by that name lived in the building because the apartment was registered under Hannah's family name. I had not planned that. It was luck, or maybe the same instinct that had kept my bank account separate. I was not hiding. I want to be precise about that. I was simply not announcing myself. Within 48 hours, David had filed a response to the assault complaint. He cited the lack of physical evidence and 2 inconsistencies in Grace's statement. First, she said the contact was on her left wrist. Then, in the written report, she said it was on her right. A small inconsistency, the kind that can happen when someone is genuinely shaken, or when someone is manufacturing a memory under pressure. "If I push this now," David told me, "they quietly withdraw it, and we gain nothing. If I let it sit and file a counterclaim for false reporting, then we have civil leverage that will make Evelyn Shaw's lawyers very uncomfortable." "Wait," I said. "For how long?" "Until I have something better to spend their discomfort on." On day 6, I moved into a small studio in Songbuk. Arthur arranged it, not as a gift, he emphasized, but as standard accommodation for an on-site consultant. The studio was on the 2nd floor of an old traditional-style building. 1 east-facing window, a floor that creaked in 3 specific places, which I learned quickly. I brought almost nothing from the apartment. My phone, my notebook, my watch, and my father's drafting table, which Brian helped me collect while Evelyn was at a board meeting. I carried it up the narrow stairs myself and placed it under the east window. That night, I sat at it and drew the first real sketch I had made in 2 years. Not a client rendering, not a required deliverable, just an idea for a community space where acoustics, could hold quiet conversation and a children's choir at the same time. I drew for 4 hours without looking at the clock. When I stopped, the room was cold, it was past midnight, and 6 sheets of paper lay covered in lines. Somewhere across the city, my wife was probably asleep, assuming I would come back once I was ready to apologize properly. That had been our pattern. I would offend her in some invisible way. She would impose a consequence. I would apologize until the air pressure returned to normal. We had done this 17 times in 3 years. I had counted. This was the 18th. Except this time, I had not apologized. I had drawn 6 pages of architecture, and for the first time in a very long time, felt awake. I met Julia Whitman on a Wednesday morning at the Songbuck project site. She stood in the middle of what would become the main community hall, holding a large paper bag and talking on the phone. She wore an oversized burnt orange sweater, wide-leg trousers, and sneakers, as if she had dressed for a slightly different dimension than mine. She was Arthur Whitman's granddaughter and the project's cultural programming director. When she ended the call, she turned and saw me in the doorway with drawings under my arm. "You look like you've been sleeping on a couch," she said. "A very good couch," I replied, which was true. Brian's couch was excellent. "I'm Julia," she said, without adding Whitman. That meant she was either modest or testing something. "Programming director. We haven't met, but my grandfather told me about you." "What did he say?" She smiled. "He said you were probably the right person for this and definitely inconvenient about it." I considered that. "Accurate." "Good," she said. Then she sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, opened her bag, and pulled out 2 coffees and a pile of notes. "Seat. I'll tell you what the spaces need to do. You tell me what is structurally possible. Then we argue constructively until we have a brief." We argued constructively for 3 hours. She wanted an acoustic ceiling that worked without panels. Annoying architecturally, but possible if the room was shaped like the inside of cupped hand. She wanted a reading alcove that felt like being inside a pocket. She wanted children to be able to see into the performance area through a window at their height, so small people could watch big things happen. Every request was spatially unusual and emotionally exact. By the end, I had filled 2 more pages of sketches, and she had 3 pages of notes covered in enthusiastic margins. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked as we packed up. "Consulting? 12 years. "No," she said, looking at my sketches. "Drawing like this. I thought about it. Since I was 20. Did you stop?" "For about 2 years. She looked at me with the directness of someone raised around powerful people and therefore unimpressed by them. "What happened 2 years ago?" "I got married," I said. She nodded, as though that explained the shape of a moderately complicated building. "Evelyn made her first contact in the 2nd week. Not in person. A message from an unknown number, clearly drafted by someone else. It said, 'I think there has been a misunderstanding. When you are ready to talk properly, I would like that opportunity.' There was no apology, only the performance of opening a door without admitting she had slammed it in my face. I read it twice, put the phone face down, and went back to work. The message was not nothing. It was data. It told me she had expected me home by now. It told me Grace had failed to locate me. It told me Evelyn had not yet spoken seriously to a divorce lawyer, because any competent divorce lawyer would have told her not to contact me directly. She was still following the script of our marriage. I withdraw. I absorb. I return. Instead, I spent 40 minutes on the phone with David reviewing the divorce filing he had quietly prepared. "She'll try for a private settlement," he said. "A contested divorce risks too much visibility for the company." "I know. Should I file?" "Hold it. For how long?" "Until waiting hurts her more than it hurts me." The following week, the Incheon brief arrived from Robert Hayes' firm. I worked on it from 6 to 9 most mornings, then spent the day on the Songbuck site. My body remembered real work immediately. It organized itself around competence as if no time had passed. Julia came to the site most days. We developed a rhythm. She described how a space should feel. I explained how it could be made to feel that way. Then we argued over the distance between the two, which turned out to be shorter than either of us expected. One afternoon, as the light shifted across the site, she asked, "Do you miss your old life?" I thought before answering. "I miss believing I was happy," I said. That is different from missing the thing itself. She wrote that down. I did not ask why. Meanwhile, gossip began moving through Evelyn's company. The arrest had not reached the press, but a CEO's husband being led out of the corporate lobby in handcuffs was the kind of texture that spreads. Brian heard from someone in the marketing department that opinion had split into 3 groups. Those who believed I had obviously done something wrong. Those who believed Evelyn had overreacted. And a quiet third group that suspected Grace Parker was at the center of something no one was saying aloud. The third group interested me. I told Brian to do nothing. Do not defend me. Do not amplify anything. Let the questions grow on their own. Then Evelyn's father called. George Shaw was 71, retired from the company, and living in a house with a garden he maintained himself. Our relationship had always been respectful coexistence. He had never opposed a marriage, but he had watched me carefully, like a man storing information. Daniel, he said, he had never called me anything more familiar. I heard about the Songbuck project. News travels, I said. Arthur Whitman is not a name people miss. A pause. I'm glad. Then another pause. Not for the reason you may think. I'm glad because you are building something. He stopped, then started again. Evelyn is not who I hoped she would become. That is all I will say. Thank you, I said, and I meant it. It was a small, precise acknowledgement from a man who owed me nothing and chose to offer something anyway. That evening, Julia sent a voice note. The reading alcove mock-up feels like a pocket. You were right about the curve. Don't be smug. I replied, I'm not smug. I'm just accurate. She wrote back. That is the smuggest possible answer. I put the phone down and realized I was smiling at my ceiling. In the 3rd week, Evelyn came in person. She arrived alone at the Songbuck site in a black car. No gracias. That was deliberate. A signal. I was reviewing load calculations with the foreman, Martin Young, when I saw her from 30 meters away. I did not change my posture. I finished what I was saying about the east wall reinforcement, then turned. She stopped 2 meters from me. Her posture was perfect. It was always perfect, but I knew her tells. The thumb pressing into the knuckle of her index finger. The half-second delay before her controlled smile appeared. She was uncomfortable. You look well, she said. Site work suits me. I'd like to talk, she said. Properly. About what specifically? Her smile thinned. She was used to conversations beginning with my apology. Without it, she had no prepared path. About what happened, she said. About where we are. Where we are, I said, is that you filed a false assault complaint against me using your assistant as the vehicle, and I've spent the last 3 weeks rediscovering that I have an architecture career. I said it flatly. Like weather. Which part would you like to discuss? False is a strong word. It is the accurate one. Then I turned back to the blueprint table. I'm on a deadline. If you want to discuss terms, contact David Lawson. His office is in Yongsan. I'll make sure he has time for your lawyer. She stood there for several seconds. Then I heard her heels retreat across the gravel. Martin said nothing for a moment. Then he pointed at the plans. About the east wall, sir. Yes, I said. Let's continue. In the 4th week, 2 things changed the geometry of everything. First, David called. The financial irregularities at Shaw Global are larger than I initially indicated. How large? If the numbers are accurate, this is criminal-level embezzlement. Not an internal correction. Not a civil issue. He paused. The outgoing funds move through executive accounts under Evelyn's signature. But the destination accounts are not hers. Whose are they? We're tracing that. But one name appears as a secondary signatory in 3 routing structures. He paused again. Grace Parker. I sat in silence for a long time. The picture assembling itself was not simple, and I did not want to rush. Grace was not merely an assistant. The complaint, the proximity, the access. These are not the actions of a loyal employee. They were the actions of a partner. The second thing happened the next morning. Arthur Whitman came to the project site with a lean man in a government-adjacent suit. They spoke privately for 15 minutes. After the man left, Arthur came to stand beside me near the east wall. For a full minute, he said nothing. Then he spoke. A regulatory review is being opened. Financial irregularities in a mid-sized corporate group. I'm not involved. I mention it only because timing is sometimes relevant information. Understood. I did not engineer this, he said. looking at me. I don't operate that way. I know, I said. You didn't have to. Some things complete themselves. He looked at the curved ceiling frame. The acoustic curve is very good. Thank you. It was disputed. Was it one? Eventually, he nodded, as if that confirmed something larger than the building. The news broke the following Tuesday. Not on the front page. Not yet. A financial industry publication ran a short item about a regulatory inquiry into the operational accounts of an unnamed mid-sized corporate group. In the financial world, that kind of unnamed article was a fire alarm in a building where everyone had been pretending not to smell smoke. Brian forwarded it to me at 8:47 a.m. Is this what I think it is? I replied, probably. At 9:15, David called. Her lawyers contacted my office this morning. They want to discuss settlement. How early? Before markets opened. Tell them we'll discuss it after I file the counterclaim for false reporting. That will make them uncomfortable. Yes, I said. That is the order of things. I want to be clear about my intentions. I did not want to destroy Evelyn. I did not want spectacle. I wanted out. Cleanly. I wanted what was mine. I wanted the assault record erased. And I wanted her to understand exactly what she had done and what she had lost. Not because I needed her pain, because I would not accept an ending where she remained confused about her role in it. The counterclaim was filed that afternoon. David handled the paperwork with his usual careful precision while the river outside his office glittered silver and indifferent. You have more leverage than anyone realizes, he said. The irregularity documents. The false reporting claim. Arthur Whitman's institutional weight behind your project. Any one of those matters. Together. He paused. You do not have to be reasonable. I know, I said. I'm choosing to be. He wrote that down too. The settlement meeting happened the following Thursday in a private hotel room. Evelyn arrived with 2 lawyers and the stillness of someone who had survived a difficult week by compressing it beneath the surface. I arrived with David, and with 4 years of invisibility, which turned out to have also been 4 years of watching. The first 20 minutes were procedural. Assets, joint filings, withdrawal of the assault complaint. I let David handle the technical weight. I watched Evelyn. The first time she looked at me, it was familiar. The same look she used across dinner tables when deciding whether I was a complication or a manageable variable. The second look came when David placed the financial irregularity summary on the table. Her eyes moved from the document to me. For the first time in 3 years, I saw something uncontrolled on Evelyn Shaw's face. How long have you known? She asked. Long enough. I'm not using this as leverage for divorce terms, I said. The regulatory inquiry proceeds independently of whatever we sign today. It is not mine to stop. Something crossed her face. Not remorse. Not fear exactly. Recognition. She finally understood that the man she had dismissed was capable of something she could not replicate. Restraint as strength. Not weakness. The terms are simple, I said. The apartment is yours. I don't want it. 12% of the joint asset pool, which is legally mine, and not a cent more. Full expungement of the assault record. A signed statement from Grace Parker confirming the incident was mischaracterized, and an undisputed divorce. Her lead lawyer began to speak. Evelyn raised one hand. He stopped. Those terms, she said, are less than you could ask for. I know. They are what I want. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, draft it. The settlement was signed 11 days later. 11 days of lawyers adjusting clauses, exchanging language about language, and David calling at odd hours to ask if I wanted to push harder. Usually I said no. Sometimes he asked, Are you certain? Yes, I said. I'm certain. After the documents were finalized, David and I had dinner near his office. He poured 2 glasses of soju and pushed one toward me. In 15 years, he said, I have never had a client who consistently asked for less than he was entitled to. I asked for what I needed, I said. That is not the same as less. He drank. No, he agreed. It isn't. The assault record was erased 10 days later. The following week, I registered a sole consulting practice under my own name. Daniel Carter Architecture. Not an agency. Not a firm. Just the name on the door. It felt like an extraordinary amount of space. Grace Parker's role in the financial irregularities became part of a formal investigation 8 days after the divorce was finalized. The story that emerged was more complicated than I first imagined. Grace had not been a passive beneficiary. She had helped design a quiet, sustained embezzlement scheme using Evelyn's access and her own trusted position to route money through minor accounts over 3 years. Evelyn's signature had been used. Whether she fully understood where the money went was a question for the courts. I did not follow it closely. It was no longer my story to judge. Looking back, I understand that Evelyn married me partly because I seemed uncomplicated. No powerful family, no dangerous network, no competing ambition. I could make the margins of her life livable without threatening the center. That calculation was not exactly malicious. It was simply wrong about what people are and what they can become after being quietly diminished. She did not account for the fact that a man with a good drafting table and 12 years of structural thinking, left alone with his own life for 6 weeks, might be harder to finish than she estimated. The Songbuck Arts Complex opened on a clear Sunday in early spring. The night before, I stayed on site until 11 for the final walkthrough. Every space I had fought for was there. The main hall and its curved acoustic ceiling. The reading alcove that felt like a pocket. The children's viewing window set at exactly the right height for a 7-year-old standing on tiptoe. The drainage was right. The east wall was solid. The sight lines worked. In the courtyard stood a single ginkgo tree that had been there before the building. The initial brief had not required keeping it. The budget had not anticipated it. But I designed around it anyway. Because in my father's old notes, I had once found a sentence written in the margin. When in doubt, build around what is already alive. On opening day, Arthur arrived first. Julia came 15 minutes later with several community arts groups and began introducing them to their future rooms with the delight of someone who had waited a year for that moment. I stood near the entrance and watched the building receive its first people. I have always believed buildings do not truly exist until people move through them. That is when architecture becomes real. At one point, Arthur stood beside me as children ran through the main hall, their voices bouncing off the ceiling exactly as the geometry predicted. Your father would have been pleased, he said. I hope so, I replied. Then I added, I think he would have asked about the drainage. Arthur laughed. A real laugh. Not polished. Not social. It made him look briefly younger. Later, Julia found me in the reading alcove. She sat in the curve, under the small high window, and said nothing at first. I sat at the other end. Our shoulders almost touched. It feels like a pocket, she said. Yes, you were right. I know. Don't be smug. 2 months later, the Incheon brief was approved. The client was a community arts coalition led by a 62-year-old woman who studied my drawings the way my father used to study plans, following not the beauty, but the logic of care inside the lines. After the review, she held one drawing to the window light. This is the kind of architecture that knows what a room is for, she said. I received the full commission 2 weeks later. Design, supervision, delivery. The budget was tight, and the client was difficult in the way people are difficult when they care deeply. That is my preferred kind of difficult. Without planning it, I became busy in the way a person becomes busy when he stops rationing his own competence. 8 months after opening, Daniel Carter Architecture had 3 active commissions and a 4th in discussion. Around the same time, the initial regulatory phase involving Shaw Global concluded. Grace was formally charged. Evelyn was found to have signed documents without full knowledge of the routing destinations. Whether that careful legal language reflected truth or negotiation was not my story anymore. I noted it, filed it, moved on. In June, Brian Hanna invited me to dinner. Hanna made too much food, which was the point, and we stayed late talking about nothing important, which is sometimes the most valuable kind of conversation. At the end of the night, Brian walked me downstairs. You look like yourself, he said. As opposed to what? He thought about it. As opposed to the version of you I hadn't seen in a while. I walked home from the subway station through the mild June night. There was no reason to hurry. I had nowhere to be except where I was going. In my studio, I turned on the lamp beside the drafting table. The east window showed the city glittering in the dark. I put the kettle on. Then I sat at the table and understood the question I had been answering all along. Not, can you survive being discarded? Not, can you take revenge on someone who wronged you? Those are not the interesting questions. The real question was this. Do you know who you are when the person who decided your value is no longer in the room? The answer, it turned out, was yes. I always had. There was one more piece of Grace Parker's story I learned later from Julia. Grace had not begun as a schemer. She had started as exactly what she appeared to be, a capable young woman from a modest background, excellent at her job, and excellent at reading what people wanted from her. For a year, she was that person. Then she recognized Evelyn's blind spot, Evelyn's absolute certainty in her own judgment. And Grace made a decision. I'm not interested in excusing her, but I am interested in accuracy. The accurate version is not simply that a villain used an innocent woman. It is more uncomfortable than that. Two people each decided that the end they wanted justified the means available to them. One had a husband. One had a signature. Both decided someone else's cost was acceptable. The difference between me and either of them is not that I am noble. It is simpler than that. I was unwilling to make that calculation. I have thought about load-bearing walls long enough to know that the thing you remove because you believe it unnecessary is sometimes the thing holding the entire structure up. In late June, Julia met me in the complex courtyard to review the second-half programming schedule. We sat on a low stone bench near the ginkgo tree with her notes and my coffee. Grandfather wants to know if you'll consider the Yunpyong extension, she said. I'll look at the brief. He said you would say that. He knows me reasonably well. She looked at me for a moment. It was not her usual professional look. It was the look from the reading alcove on opening day, when the light came through the high window and neither of us spoke for a while. I told my grandfather you're good at this, she said. At architecture, at people, she said. The way you design for them. Not for their ideal selves, for the way they actually are. The clumsy ones. The small ones who want to see big things. I looked at the ginkgo tree. I had a good teacher, I said. He didn't tell me directly, but he left good notes. She nodded and did not push. She had the intelligence to know when something had already been fully said. We worked for an hour, arguing, refining, reaching something better than either of us had started with. At the end, she packed her notes, stood, and paused. I like working with you, she said. It was a simple sentence. It was not a small one. I like working with you too, I said. She left. I stayed on the bench with my coffee and listened to the building behind me doing what buildings are supposed to do. Holding people inside, keeping out what should stay out, making the space between four walls feel, against all structural logic, like belonging. This is the last chapter, and I want to be honest about what kind of ending it is. It is not triumphant. Triumph implies a contest with a clear winner, and I no longer think in those terms. It is not perfectly peaceful either. Not everything is resolved. Not everyone is healed. Not every account is settled. It is something more specific. It is true. Here is what is true. Evelyn now runs a smaller company under restructured governance, with a compliance officer who reports to the board instead of to her. People who still move in those circles say she is more careful than she used to be. Whether she is better in the way that matters, I do not know. I have stopped wondering. Here is also true. Arthur Whitman attended the Yunpyong Extension Planning meeting in August. He said nothing for 40 minutes while I presented the initial concepts. At the end, he said, the courtyard plan. It's like Songbuk. Yes, I said. Keep doing that. I intend to. He still runs his foundation from his house. He calls once a week to ask how the Yunpyong work is progressing. Sometimes, at the end of a call, he mentions something my father once said, briefly and without ceremony, the way one person passes another something they left behind. And here's what is most true. I live in a studio in Songbuk. My father's drafting table sits under the east window. The floor still creaks in 3 specific places. I know them well. Sometimes I step on them deliberately because I have decided the creak of a known floor is the exact sound of a place that belongs to you. Julia and I are. I lack the word that is both precise and not overstated. We are in the early stages of something neither of us is rushing. We have both spent enough time around buildings to know that the structures worth keeping are allowed to settle before they bear weight. What I know about myself now, what I have earned the right to know, is this. I was never the person Evelyn thought I was. I was never a man who could be domesticated by dismissal, or diminished by a holding cell, or finished by a turn back. I was the man with the drafting table, the man with the list of 11 mistakes, the man stubborn enough to believe that when in doubt, you build around what is already alive. My father knew it. Arthur suspected it. Julia sees it every time she writes. You are just accurate, in a margin of something important. And I, here in the studio, on this morning, in this exact longitude of a life that is entirely mine, know it too. The kettle begins to sing. I turn from the window, and I begin.